I like this thing. When people told me to wear a mask, I wore this. It made them upset. That's why I like this thing. It makes people upset and it looks really goofy. The thing about psychos is they can always find some good in all the bad they did. And I think that is Lieutenant Cage's personality basically. Is he always finds the silver lining. He always finds the silver lining. He can always justify his actions. And a lot of his actions are justifiable. The tramp of booted feet echoes around us as the Navy armsman marches back to our cells. Left and right, along the seemingly endless corridor, are the vaulted archways leading to the cargo bays, modified to carry human cargo and supposedly total security. There are 20 of the massive cells in all. Originally, each held 200 men. But after the past 30 months of near constant war, nearly all of them stand empty now. It'll be even emptier for the rest of the trip. There's only about 250 of us after the defense of Deliverance. The armsmen swagger around, shot cannons grasped easily in their heavily gloved hands or slung over their shoulders. Their faces are covered by helms of their heavy-duty work suits, and their flash-protective visors conceal their features. Only the name badges, stitched their left shoulder straps, show me that the same 10 men have been escorting my platoon for the past 2.5 years. I see the colonel waiting up ahead, with someone standing next to him. As we get closer, I see that it's Cronin, his thin, small body half hunched, as if weighed down by some invisible burden. The lieutenant's narrow eyes flit and dart from side to side, constantly scanning the shadows, and he flinches as I step up to Schaefer and salute. Lieutenant Cronin is the only survivor of 3rd Platoon, the colonel tells me, as he waves the Arsman to move the others inside. So I am putting him with you. In fact, with so few of you left, you're going to be gathered into a single formation now. You will be in charge. Green was killed in Deliverance. How, sir? I ask, curious as to what happened to the other lieutenant. One of the 150 last chancers, who was alive 2 days ago, is now food for the flesh ants and nameless planet below us. He was diced by a strangle web, the colonel says coldly, no sign of any emotion on his face at all. I wince inside, being slowly cut up as he tried to struggle out of a constricting mesh of barbed muscle is a nasty way to go. Basically, the net got over him and like constricted him until he was like turned into mince. It would be a bad way to go for sure. I'm leaving you to organize the rest of the men into squads and into detailed special duties, the colonel says before stepping past me and striding down the corridor. An apartmento flunky, swathed in an oversized brown robe, hurries down to the colonel, carrying a massive bundle of parchments, and they are both lost in distant gloom. Inside, orders an armsman from behind me. Oh, inside! Orders an armsman from behind me, his name tag showing him to be Warrant Officer Hopkinson. The massive cell doors clang shut behind me, leaving me locked in this room with 10 score murderers, thieves, rapists, heretics, looters, shirkers, desecrators, grave robbers, necrophiles, maniacs, insubordinates, blasphemers, and a whole other sordid vermin for company. Still, it makes for an interesting conversation sometimes. Right, I call out, my voice rebounding off the high metal ceiling and distant bulkheads. All sergeants, get your sorry hides over here. As the order is passed around the massive holding pin, I gaze over my small force. There's a couple hundred of us left now, sitting or lying around in scattered groups or on the metal decking, stretching away into the gloom of the chamber. Their voices babble quietly, making the metal walls ring slightly, and I can smell the combined sweat from several days on the furnace hot planet below. In a couple of minutes, 8 men are stood around me. I catch sight of an unwelcome face. Who made you a sergeant? Rollis? I demanded, stepping up to stand right in front of his blubbery face, staring right into his black eyes. Lieutenant Green did, he says defiantly, marching my stare. Well, you're just a trooper now, you piece of dirt, I snap at him, pushing him away. Get out of my sight, you fragging traitor. You can't do this, he shouts, taking a step toward me and half raising a fist. My elbow snaps up sharply and connects with his throat, sending him gasping on the floor. Can't I? I snarl at him. I guess I can't do this either, I say, kicking him in the ribs. Forgetting about the murderers, it's the out and out traitors like him that make me want to leave. With a venomous glance, he gets to his hands and knees and crawls away. Right, I said, turning to the others, putting that fat piece of filth out of my mind. Where were we? Alarm sirens are sounding everywhere, a piercing shrill that sets your teeth on edge. I'm standing with a new Modoc grasped in my hands, its engine chugging comfortably, wisps of oily smoke leaking from its exhaust vents. Hurry up, wreck the place! Someone shouts from behind me. I can hear the sound of machinery being smashed, pipelines being cut, and energy coils being shattered. There's a panel of dials in front of me, and I place the head of the hammer against it, thumbing up the revs on the engine to full, the air filling with flying splinters of glass and shards of torn metal. Sparks of energy splash across my heavy coveralls, leaving tiny burn marks on the thick gloves covering my hands. I turn the pneumatic on a huge Garand chain mechanism behind me, sending toothed wheels clanging into the ground, and the heavy chain whipping past my head. They're coming! The earlier voice calls out over the din of twisted metal and fractured glass. I look over my shoulder to see a bunch of security men hurrying around an archway to my left, wearing heavy carapace breastplates, colored dark red with twisted chain and the eye mark of the Harpikian Union picked out in bold yellow. They've all got vicious looking slug guns, black enameled pieces of metal that catch the light menacingly. People hurrying past jostle me, but it's hard to see their faces. It's like they're in a mist or something. I get a glimpse of a half rotten skull, resembling a man called Snowden. But I know that Snowden died a year ago, fighting pirates in the Xandus Belt. Other faces, faces of men who are dead, fill past. There's a thunderous roar, and everybody starts rushing forward. I realize that the Harpikian guards are firing. Bullets ricochet all over the place, zinging off pieces of machinery and thudding into the flesh of those around me. I try to run, but my feet feel welded to the floor. I look around desperately for somewhere to hide, but there isn't anywhere. Then I'm alone with the security men, the smoking muzzles of their guns pointing in my direction. There's a blinding flash and the thunder of shooting. I wake up from the dream, gasping for breath, sweat coating my skin despite the chill of the large cell. I fling aside the thin blanket that serves as my bed and sit up, placing my hands on the cold floor. As to steady myself, as dizziness from sudden movement swamps me. Gulping down what feels like a dead rat in my mouth, I look around. There's the usual night cycle activity, mumbles and groans from the sleepless, the odd murmured prayer as some other soul is afflicted by the sleep demons. It's always the same once you've dropped into the immaterium. I've had the same nightmare in night and warp space for the past 3 years. Every since I joined the Imperial Guard. I'm always back in the hive on Olympus, carrying out a wreck raid on a rival factory. Sometimes it's the Harpikian Union, like tonight. Other times, it's against the Jorian consuls, and sometimes even the nobles of the enlightened. But we never dared to do that for real. There's always the Walking Dead as well. Folks from my past come back to haunt me. People I've killed, comrades who have died, my family, all of them appear in my nightmares. Lately, I've realized that there's more and more of them after every battle. Like the fallen are being added to my dreams. I always end up dying as well, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing. Sometimes I'm blown apart by gunfire. Other times, I'm sawn in half by a power axe or a chainsword. Sometimes, I'm burnt alive by fire throwers. Several people have told me that the warp is not bound in time, like the real universe. Instead, you might see images from your past or your future all mixed together in strange ways. Interpreting warp dreams is a speciality of Lamax, one of the ex-departmental men. I think they threw him into the penal legions for blasphemy after he offered to read the dreams of a quartermaster major. He says it's my fear of death being manifested. Suddenly, there's a demented screaming from the far end of the cargo hold where we're held, down where the lighting has gone fritzy, and its arrhythmic pulsing gives you a headache. Nobody slept down there for months, not since there was enough room for everyone to fit on this end. With everyone gathered in one cell now, everyone must have to try to get some sleep down there. I push myself to my feet and pull my boots over my bare feet. As I walk towards the commotion, I rub a hand across my bared chest to wipe off the sweat. My body tingles all over with a bizarre feeling of energy. The map of scars traced across my torso feels strangely hot under my fingertips. I look down, half expecting the old wounds to be glowing. They're not. I tramp into the gloom, watched by most of the others. The screaming's loud enough to wake up the Navy ratings the next deck up. I understand their suspicion and morbid curiosity, because sometimes when a man starts screaming in warp space, it isn't with his own voice. Luckily, it's never happened to anyone I know, but there are guys who tell me tales of men being possessed by creatures from the warp. They either go completely mad and kill a load of people before collapsing and dying, or they get taken completely over, becoming a body for some strange creature's mind, in which case they'll stalk around the corridors calmly, murdering anyone they come across. And that's even when the Materium shielding is still working. You don't want to know what happens on a ship whose warp wards collapse under the continuous assault from formless beings intent on the death of the ship's crew. Emperor of Terra, watch over me, I whisper to myself, as I'm halfway towards the source of the screeching. If it is a touched one, this could be really serious trouble. They don't allow us anything that can be used as a weapon, so we are virtually defenseless. Still, that's just as well, really, because there'd be a hell lot of less. There'd be a hell lot of there would be a hell of a lot less of us if we were still armed. Fights break out a lot, but despite what some people think, it takes a while to beat someone to death, and somebody usually breaks it up before there's a casualty. That said, if I want to kill someone, I could, particularly if they're sleeping. My whole body's shaking, and I'm not quite sure why. I try to tell myself it's the cold, but I'm man enough to admit when I'm scared. Men don't scare me, except perhaps the Colonel. Aliens give me shudders now and then, especially the Tyranids. But there's something about the idea of wharf creatures that just shivers me to the core, even though I've never had to face one before. There's nothing that I can think of in the galaxy that's more unholy. I can see someone thrashing around in a blanket ahead, just where the lights go gloomy. It's hard to see in the intermittent haze of the broken globe, but I see Cronin's face twisting and turning. I hear footsteps behind me and turn suddenly, almost lashing out at Franks, who's gotten up and followed me. Just warp dreams, he tries to reassure me, with a crooked smile, his big hands held up in reflex. Like that makes me feel any better, I reply, turning back to the writhing figure of Cronin. I can just about make out words and the shrieks bursting from his contorted mouth. And from the depths there rose a mighty beast of many eyes and many limbs, and the beast from the darkness did set upon the light of mankind, and the hateful thirst of unnatural hunger. Don't wake him, Frank hisses, as I reach a hand towards the struggling figure. Why not? I said, kneeling down before Cronin and glaring back at the sergeant. Preacher Durant once said that waking a man with warp dreams empties his mind, allows chaos to seep in, he says, with an earnest look on his face. Well, I'll just have to risk a bit of corruption, won't I tell him, annoyed at what seems like a childish superstition to me. If it carries on like this for the rest of the cycle, I'm not going to get any sleep at all. I rest a hand on Cronin's shoulder, gently at first, but squeezing more firmly, when he continues to toss and turn. But it still doesn't do any good. I lean over him and slap him hard on the cheek with the back of my hand. His eyes snap open, and there's a dangerous light in them for a moment. But that's quickly replaced by a vague recognition. He sits up and looks straight at me, his eyes squinting in the faltering light. St. Lucius spake upon the masses of Belshazzar, and great was their uproar of delight, he says with a warm smile on his thin lips. But his eyes quickly fill with a haunted look. Guess that means thanks, I say to Franks, standing up as Cronin lowers himself back down into the blanket. Glancing around once more before closing his eyes, I stay there for a couple more moments until Cronin's breathing is shallow and regular again, meaning he's either really asleep or faking it well enough for me not to care anymore. Why the hell did Green have to get himself killed, I ask myself as I trudge back to my sleeping area. I could go without the responsibility of wet nursing this bunch of frog for brains criminals. It's hard enough just to survive in the last chances without having to worry about everyone else. I guess I'll just have not to worry. Let them take care of themselves. Hell, if they can't do that, they deserve to die. It's a few days after the incident with Cronin, and we're sitting down for mess in the middle of the cell, sprawling in the floor with dishes of protein globs in front of us. We have to spoon it out by hand. They won't give us any kind of cutlery in case it can be sharpened into a blade of some sort. It's this kind of attitude that can really break a man. Them not trusting you, even to sit down for a meal without being at each other's throats. The food is also picked to grind you down. I know for a fact that they brought hundreds of hornheads on board from the plains of around Deliverance. But do we see any sign of freshly slaughtered meat? Do we ever? No. It's the same brown, half liquid slush that you have to shovel into your mouth with your fingers, feeling it slide horribly down your throat with the consistency of cold vomit. You get used to it after a while. You have to. You just shove it in, swallow, and hope you don't gag too much. It doesn't even taste of anything except the brackish water it's mixed with. It's cold and slimy, and more than once, I felt like hurling the stuff back into the armsmen's faces. But that'd just get me a kicking and the chance to go hungry. For all of its lack of delights, it certainly fills your stomach and keeps you going, which is what it's supposed to do. As usual, I'm sitting with Franks and Gappo, who are the closest things to friends I've got within this miserable outfit. We spend a few minutes cramming our faces with sludge before thrashing it down with reconstituted fruit juice. For some people, fruit juice might seem like an extravagance, but aboard a ship where the air is constantly refiltered over and over again, and there's only artificial light and close confines, it's the best way of stopping any diseases. There are tales of whole ship's crews being wiped out by thaliosis fever or Murmerian chloredia, but that's too much of a risk to take when you only need to give a man a half a pint of juice a day to stave off the worst. Ever thought of trying to get out while I'm bored? France asks, using one of his little fingers to wipe away the last bits of protein from the rim of his dish. I've heard it was possible, Gap says, pushing the dish away before digging his mouth into his mouth with his fingernail to extract a fragment of protein chunk. Some of the crew reckon there's places a man can hide forever, I add, before pouring the rest of the fruit juice down my mouth and swilling it to remove the horrid texture left from the gloop. This ship isn't that big, but there's hundreds of places that no one goes anymore. Places between the decks, in the ducting, down by the engines. You could creep out and steal what you need to eat. It wouldn't be difficult. Yeah, Franks says with a curled lip. But it ain't exactly freedom, is it? And what would you call freedom? Gappo asks, lying back onto his elbow, stretching his long legs out in front of him. Not sure, the sergeant says with a shrug. Guess I'd like to choose what I eat, where I go, who I know. I've never been able to do that, I tell them. In the hive factories, it's just as much of a matter of survival as it is here. Kill or be killed. With the trade wars, win or starve. It's that simple. None of us knows what freedom is, Gappo said, rocking his head from side to side to work out his stiff muscle. But when I was a preacher, all that I knew were the Holy Scriptures and the dogma of the ecclesiarchy. They told me exactly what I was supposed to know and how to act and feel in any kind of situation. They told me who was right and who was wrong. I realize now that I didn't have any freedom. I'm from an agri world, Frank says, just a farmer. Wasn't much hardship. Had lots of machines. Single man could tend 1,500 hectares. Was always plenty to eat. Women were young and healthy. Nothing more a man could want. So why the bloody hell did you join the guard? Gappo blurts out. Didn't get any fragged choice, did I, Franks? Says bitterly, a sore look on his face. Got listed for the Departmental Minitorium tithe when the orcs invited Arthas Colvin. I was mustered. That was it. No choice. Yeah, I butt in. But you must have settled in all right. You made major after all. Being in the guard turned out all right, the sergeant says, leaning forward to stack his dish on top of Gappo's. Tell the truth, I like the discipline. As a trooper, I didn't have to worry about anything except orders. Got foddered and watered. And the comfort, whatever I was told to do, would be the right thing. But as you got promoted, that must have changed, Gappo interdicts, leaning back again. Did. That was the problem, Franks continues, wringing his curly hair with a hand. Higher up the chain of command I got, less I liked it. Soon, making decisions that got men killed and men maimed. All of a sudden, it felt like it was all my responsibility. Colonel was a born officer, one of them. Didn't give a second thought to troopers. Was just making sure he could sneak his way up to the great greasy pole of the upper ranks, hoping to make commander general or war master. That's why you went over the edge, I ask, knowing that Franks was in the last chances for inciting subordination and disobeying orders. Right, he says, his face grim with the memory, his voice deep and embittered. Stuck in the middle of an ice plane on Fortuna 2. Been on half rations for a month because the rebels kept shooting down our supply shuttles. Got the order to attack a keep called Lascar Citadel, 24 leagues across bare ice. Officers were dining on stewed horn deer and braised black ox, drinking Chilean brandy. My men were eating dried food substitutes and making water from snow. Led my 2 companies into the officers' camp and demanded supplies for the march. Departmental bastards turned us down flat, and the men went on rampage, looting everything. I didn't try to stop them. They were cold and starving. What was I supposed to do? Order them back in the ice wastes to attack an enemy-held fort with an empty stomach? That's kind of what happened to you, Gappo, I said to the ex-preacher, making a pillow out of my thin blanket and lying down with my hands behind my head. The haves and the have-nots? He asks, not expecting an answer. I can see why Franks here did what he did. But to this day, I have not the faintest clue what made me denounce a cardinal in front of half a dozen Imperial Guard officers. Think you are right, Franks said. Cardinals shouldn't have executed men who were laying down their lives in the defense of his palaces. But you had to go and accuse the whole ecclesiarchy of being corrupt, I added with a grin, questioning whether there really was an emperor. How stupid are you? Can't imagine being able to carry on if there wasn't an emperor, Frank says, shaking his head, trying to comprehend the ideas. Would have killed myself as soon as I was hauled in by the colonel, if that was the case. You really believe you have a soul to save? Gappo asks with obvious contempt. You believe this magnificent emperor cares, one bit or another, whether you die serving the Imperium or as a disobedient looter? Hey, I snap at both of them. Let's drop this topic, shall we? It's at that point that Pole walks over, face scrunched up into a vicious snarl. He's done it again. He's done it again, he says through gritted teeth. Rollis, I ask, already knowing the answer, pushing myself up to my feet. Pole nods and I follow him towards the far end of the prison, where he and what's left of Cronin's old platoon usually eat now. Cronin is sitting there, looking dejected. I shall steal from the plate of decadence to feed the mouths of the powerless, the mad lieutenant says. That's the sermons of Sebastian Thor. I know that one, puts in Pole, standing just behind my right shoulder. Where's Rollis? I ask. One of the men lounging on the ground nods his head, and I see the traitor sat with his back to the cell, about 10 meters away. Trust them to leave it up to me. Most of them hate Rollis, just like I do. They're just scared the treacherous bastard is going to do something to them if they stand up to him. And the colonel's wrath is another factor. Well, I won't stand for it. Having to breathe the same air as him makes me want to rip his lungs out. I march up to stand in front of the scumbag. He's got a half bowl in his slab. I stand there with my hands on my hips. I'm shaking with anger. I detest this man so much. Slow eater, aren't you? I hiss at Rollis. He looks at me slowly with his tiny black eyes. Just because I'm more civilized than you animals, I don't have to put up with these insults, he says languidly, putting the dish to one side. You took Cronin's food again. A statement, not a question. I asked him if he would share his ration with me, he says with a sly smile. He didn't say no. He said, and the bounties of the Emperor shall go to those who have worked it hard in his service, Paul interjects from behind me. Sounds like a big frag off if you ask me. I warned you last time, Rollis, I said heavily, sickened at the sight of his blubbery face. One warning is all you get. His eyes filled with fear, and he opens his mouth to speak, but my boot fills it before he can say anything, knocking bloodied teeth across his lap. He clamps his hands to his jaws, whimpering with pain. I turn away, and I hear him move behind me, and I look back over my shoulder. Bastard! He spits at me, halfway to his feet, blood and spittle dribbling down his chin. I'll frag and get you back for this, you sanctimonious son of an orc. Keep going, and you'll need soup in the future. I laughed back at him. I'd pity the piece of Grog's crap if he wasn't such a scumbag. He slumps back down again, probing at a tooth with a finger, eyes filled with pure venom. He looks as though he really could kill, if looks could kill. If he tries it again, I said, Paul, break the fingers on his left hand. You'll find it harder to eat then, but he can still pull a trigger. I'll back you up. Paul glances at the trader, obviously relishing the thought. I hope he tries it again, he says darkly, glaring at Rollis. I just hope he does. In the dim, ruddy glow of an old star, the Tyranid fleet drifted remorselessly onwards. The smaller drone ships huddled under the massive crater-pocked carapaces of the hive ships. The larger vessels slowly coiling in on upon themselves to enter a dormant state that allowed them to traverse the vast distances between stars. The clouds of spores were disappearing, scattering slowly in the solar winds. One hive ship was still awake, feeder tentacles wrapped around the shattered hull of an Imperial warship, digesting the mineral content, the flesh of the dead crew, leeching off the air contained within to sustain itself. Across the heavens, the flotilla of bioships stretched out, impelled by instinct to hibernate again until they found new prey and new resources to plunder. In their wake, a bare rock orbited a star, scoured of every organic particle, stripped of all but the most basic elements. Nothing was left on the farming world of Langosta 3. There were no testaments to the humans who had once lived there. Now all was left as an airless asteroid, the unmarked dying place of 3 million people. All that remained of them was raw genetic material, stored within the great hive ships, ready to be turned into more hunters, more killing machines. Operation New Sun in place, ready for your arrival. Operation Harvest preparing progress to next stage. Only the insane can truly prosper. You could say the dropping out of warp space seems like having your body turned inside out by some great invisible hand. You could say it's like you've been scattered into fragments and then reassembled in the real universe. You could say that your brain buzzes with images of birth and death, each flashing into your brain and then disappearing in an instant. I've heard it described like this, and many other fanciful ways, by other soldiers and travelers. You could say it was like these things, but you'd be lying. Because it isn't like any of them. In fact, you'd hardly notice that you've dropped out of warp space at all. There's a slight pressure at the back of your mind, and then a kind of release of tension, like you've just hit a stim shot or something. You relax a little, breathe a little more easily. Well, that's how it's always been for me. And nobody else seems to have come up with a more accurate description that I know of. Then again, maybe you don't actually get that. Perhaps it's all in your mind. I know that I'm damned well relieved every time we drop back into real space, because it's a whole lot less dangerous than the other side. Considering the outfit I'm in these days, that's saying a hell of a lot, because each drop is just a prelude to the next blood soaked battle. I'm standing in the upper starboard gallery, along with another 2 dozen half last chancers. Another 2 dozen last chancers. The row of windows to our right continues for several meters. The wood paneled wall on the inner bulkhead stretches unbroken on the other side, leaving a massive corridor 30 meters wide, where we can run back and forth along its length, but without any nooks or crannies in the featureless room to hide behind. There's only one door at the end of the gallery, each protected by a squad of armsmen with load shot cannons. Steeled, sterile, contained, just like the colonel wanted. We're fortunate that we're on exercise when the drop happens. The shutters of the massive viewing ports grind out of sight, leaving a distant blue star. We're too far away to see any worlds yet. We've still got to go in system, under ordinary plasma drives. Paul strides up to me, sweat dripping off of him from his physical exertions. Are we here? He asks, dripping his forehead, wiping his forehead with the back of his good hand. Haven't got a fragging clue, I tell him with a deep shrug. I catch the eye of a naval officer watching over us from the rear of the gallery. He walks over with a half confident, half nervous look. Don't ask me how he manages, but he seems to convey a sense of superiority. But the look on his eye doesn't match it. He glances quickly to check that the armsmen are still close at hand and stops in front of me. What do you want? He demands, his lip curled as if he was talking to a pool of sick. Just wondering where we are, I said to him with a pleasant smile. I'm in a good mood for some reason. Most likely because we're out of warp space. As I said before, I'm not up for any Navy baiting today. System XV 108. That's where we are, he replies with a smirk. All right, says Pohl, lounging an arm across my shoulder and leaning in towards the Navy officer. XVO8. That is right next to XVO9. I have heard of it. Have you? The lieutenant asks, jerking himself up straight, clearly startled. Oh, yeah, says Pohl, his voice totally deadpan, his face radiating sincerity. I hear this place is Grok's country. Nothing but Grok's farms, far as the eye can see. They say that folks around here are so keen on Groks, they live with them, sleep with them, even have kids by them. Really? The lieutenant asks, his pudgy face screwed up with genuine repulsion, though. That's right, Pohl continues, casting a mischievous glance at the Navy man that didn't notice. In fact, looking at you, aren't you sure your mother wasn't a Grox? And your father a lonely farmer? Certainly not. My father was a. He starts back before actually realizing what Paul's been saying. Damn you, penal scum! Schaefer will hear about this. Is that all right, Trooper? The lieutenant asks, spits back, taking a step towards us. When the lash is taking strips off your back, would you do well to remember that it's a naval rating doing it to you? With that, he spins on the spot and marches off, the thick heels of his naval boots thudding loudly on the wood paneled floor. Pohl and I just burst out laughing, and I can see his shoulders tense even more. It's a couple of moments before we can control ourselves. Each time I look at Pohl, I can see his innocent face and Lieutenant's enraged look. Hasn't got a damn name, Pohl says when he's calmed down a little, standing looking out of the nearest viewport, looking pale against the blackness of the high arched window that stretches up at least another 10 meters above his head. That's worrying, I said, stepping beside him. Even the newest system usually gets a name, even if it's just the same name as the ship or the man who found it. No name? No name, Paul mutters to himself for a moment, before turning to look at me, his hand and hook clasped behind his back, like an officer or something. I just had a thought. No name probably means it's a dead system. No life bearing worlds, right? Could be, I said, though I wouldn't really know. Unlike Paul, who was brought up by the school of Progranium, my education consisted more of how to work a las lathe and parry an axe blow with a crowbar. And the dead system is just the place you'd put a penal colony, he asks, he suggests, looking back out the window. More interested this time. You think they're going to offload us? I asked him with an incredulous look. Of course not, he says, still staring out of the viewport. But we could be getting some more men in, and that would make a sense. I see your point, I said, turning and leaning back against the thick armored glass of the port. It's been 2.5 years, and we've not a single new member. And maybe he's organizing us into one big platoon to make room for the fresh faces, Paul says, his face showing a thoughtful impression. Hang on, though, I said, a sudden thought crossing my mind. Wouldn't it be better to have the old timers in charge of the squads and platoons? What? Have us teaching them all the tricks we've learned? He says with a laugh. The colonel knows better than that. We lounge around and jaw a bit more, strolling back and forth along the gallery after one of the armsmen prompts us to carry on exercising instead of loafing. We're talking about what we'd do if we ever got out of the last chancers when there's an interruption. Lieutenant Cage! A voice barks out from behind me, and I automatically stand to attention. The parade drills bang me so hard that I can't stop myself responding to a voice with that much authority. Emperor, damn me, it's the colonel, hisses Pole, standing to my left. That bloody naval bastard fragged us. The colonel walks up behind us. I can hear his slow, certain steps thudding on the floor. Face front, guardsman, he says, and we both spin on the spot in perfect unison, moving with instinct rather than thought. If it's about that naval lieutenant, sir, I began to excuse myself, but he cuts off with a short, cropping motion with his hand. His gold epaulets swing in the motion. Between you and me, he says quietly, leaning in forward to look at us face to face, I don't care what the Navy thinks of you. It could not be any worse than what I think of you. We stand there in silence for a moment, and he glances sharply at both of us, clearing his throat with a short cough as he stands up straight again. Cage, he tells me, looking at the other last chancers in the gallery, you will be escorted to my chambers after exercise to receive briefing about your next mission. Yes, sir, I snap back, keeping my face neutral, even though inside I feel like dropping to the deck and beating my head against the wooden planks. The relaxation I felt for the last hour after my dropping out of the warp disappears totally, and tension seeps into my muscles and bones again. So we're here to fight again. No new recruits, no fresh blood. We're just here to fight in some other bloody war. To die, perhaps. Well, that's the life of a last chancer. That's all that there is left for us. Lieutenant Cage. I don't know. It's hard. He's a great protagonist because it's kind of hard to separate him from me. He's kind of like a Gordon Freeman almost character in a way because he doesn't really say much. He's kind of like a good guy. I don't know. Just because you're a good guy doesn't mean you're a good guy. Lieutenant Cage is from a hive world. Gapo was a farmer, and then Franks was a priest, and then Pole was an aristocrat. Pole has a hook for a hand. I'm trying to give them like all names and like all voices, but they don't live long. And I mean, there's just so many characters, and so few of them live long. I don't know. These guys lived for a while, but I got Pole's voice down. It's a little bit heavy handed. I got it down though. I gave him an original voice. Pole has his very own voice I've never done for anyone else before, which is great. I'm trying my darndest not to make every single like pompous person sound very aristocratic, because they are supposed to sound all British, but that gets tiring. That it's kind of like, in Republic Commando, you're all clones of the same guy, but I think the only voice actor from that Polynesian guy, the only voice actor, he does the protagonist, but the other people, they sound way different. And I mean that's kind of, I mean, you would pick up the differences at that point. It's just like when everyone's wearing a uniform, even then everyone looks very different, even with everyone wearing a uniform. That's the beauty of the uniform, I guess. The armsman taps politely at the paneled and lacquered door before opening it inwards and waving me inside with the muzzle of his shot cannon. I step inside, as I've done 100 times before, and stand to attention, my polished boots sinking in the thick carpet. Behind me, I hear the door close and the ring of the armsman's boots standing to attention on the corridor decking. The colonel glances up from behind his massive desk and then looks back at the data slate before him, immediately seeming to forget my presence. He presses his thumb to an identification slate on the side of the data slate and it makes a whirring noise, which I recognize as the erase function operating. He replaces the device carefully on the desk in front of him, lying it parallel to the edge closest to me, before looking in my direction again. At ease, he tells me, as he stands up and begins to pace up and down behind his high backed chair for a few moments, hands clasped behind his back. It's then that I realize that it was the pose Pole was imitating earlier, and I fight hard to hold back a smirk. He stops walking and looks at me sharply, and I gulp, thinking for a second that he can read my mind. Tyranids! Cage! He says obtusely, pacing back and forth, turning his gaze toward me once more. What about him, sir? I ask after a moment, realizing he was waiting for me to say something. Some of them may be in this system, he tells me, not looking at me. But from his posture, I can tell that somehow every sense he had was directed towards me. There's probably nothing for us to do. Oh, there's probably nothing for us to do, I say boldly, hoping that perhaps we'd arrive too late for the one we'd missed, for once we'd missed the battle. That may be the case, Cage, he says slowly, stopping now to look directly at me. We are here to ascertain why communication with our outpost on the Third World has been lost. We suspect that a small scouting fleet from Kraken was heading this way. As he turns to his desk to pick up a transparent copy of a terminal readout, I wonder who we was meant to include. As far as I know, we're a bit of a rogue element, really, bouncing across this part of the galaxy, dropping in on any wars that we happen to come across. I've not heard anything about who the colonel's superiors might be, if he has any at all. Do you remember the first battle of these last chancers? He asks, suddenly sitting down, more relaxed. Of course, sir, I say immediately, wondering what he meant by these last chancers. I could never forget Icar 4. I wish I could, and I've tried, but I'll never forget it. He replies with a non-committal grunt and offers me transparency. It's covered in lines and circles, and I recognize it as some kind of star chart. There are tiny runes inscribed against the crosses, drawn in a line that arcs from one end to the other, but it might as well be written in Hungarian, Hungarian, for all I can understand. I give the colonel a blank look and realize I haven't got a clue what I'm holding. It seems that defending Icar 4 was not necessarily the best plan in the world, he says heavily, tugging the readout from my fingers and placing it in the vellum-colored envelope in the center of his desk. Saving 190 billion people. Oh, saving 190 billion people was a bad plan, sir? I ask, amazed what the colonel was implying. If by doing so we cause 500 people to die, then yes, he says, giving me a stern look, warning me to not continue my train of thought. 500 billion, sir? I ask, totally confused and unsure what the colonel is talking about. When we broke the Tyranid fleet attacking Icar 4, most of it was not destroyed, he tells me, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the polished marble of the desk. His black-gloved hands clasped in front of him. That part of the Hive fleet was simply shattered. Much of it we managed to locate and destroy while the Tyranids were still reeling from their defeat. However, we believe a sizable proportion of their survivors that had attacked Icar 4 coalesced into a new fleet, heading in a different direction. It is impossible to say exactly where they are heading, but reports from monitoring stations and patrol vessels indicate that its course might lead straight into the heart of the sector we are now in, the Typhon sector. If we had let them have Icar 4, we might have mustered more of a defense and destroyed the Tyranids utterly, rather than scattering them to hell and back, where we cannot find them, and it is impossible to track them down until too late. So instead of losing a planet, we could lose the whole of the Typhon sector? I ask, finally catching on to what the colonel was implying. That's where 500 billion people might die. Now do you see why it is important that we know exactly where this Hive fleet is heading? He asks, an earnest look on his bony face. I certainly do, I reply, my hand reeling with the thought of what would happen. It's so many people you can't picture it. It's far more than a hive, more than an entire hive world. 500 billion people, all of them devoured by hideous, unfeeling aliens, as if the Tyranids couldn't be stopped. This is The Last Chancers. I've read this book many times. I have 2 copies of this book, and they both look just as awful because I've read it so many times. I don't think that books will end up being sold in stores. I think that Barnes and Noble and all that, they might be able to downsize significantly. And that might even make things better because when I go in, sometimes it's kind of nice to talk to people, but there's just too much space, really. Sometimes there's too much space, I think. So maybe downsizing it would be good. But I think that ultimately Amazon, what Netflix did to Blockbuster, Amazon is going to do to books for sure. Because I just don't think people buy them, and when they buy them, I don't think they read them. And I mean, I don't blame people because it's hard for me. It's difficult for me to like just sit down and read sometimes. That's why I read out loud, is because it's like challenging and it's engaging, and it keeps me engaged with the reading. The dream is slightly different this time. We're defending one of our own factories against shapeless greenmen I've never seen before. They hiss and cackle at me as they charge. Their vaguely humanoid bodies shifting and changing, covered in what looks like scales. A sound close by pulls me from my sleep, and I glance a shadow over me. Before I can do anything, something heavy falls on my face and pushes down over my mouth and nose, stifling me. I lash out, but my fist connects with air, and something hard rams into my gut, expelling what little air is in my lungs. I flail around helplessly for another second. I can hear the other man, panting hard, feel the warmth of his body near me. The cloth on my face smells rank with old sweat, making me want to gag even more. Suddenly, the weight lifts off me, and I hear a shrill titter and gasp. I throw off the thing on my face, noting it's a shirt, and I glance up to see Rollis. Behind him is Cronin, a sock wrapped around the trader's throat, a knot in it hard to press against his windpipe. The ex-lieutenant giggles again. And vengeance shall be the emperor's, said Saint Hephaestus. Cronin laughs, wrenching harder on the improvised garret and pulling Rollis back towards the decking. Cronin leads over Rollis's shoulder, twisting the sock tighter, and bites his ear, blood dribbling to his chin, down onto Rollis's neck as he looks up and grins at me. Rollis's face is blue now, and his eyes bulging under heavy-set brow. I chamber to my feet, unsteady, my head still light from being choked. Let him go, Cronin, I say, taking a shaky step toward them. Killing Rollis like this will just get Cronin executed, and me as well. The colonel's ordered it before, and he won't hesitate to do it again. And the emperor's thanks for those who had been bountiful in their gifts would be eternal, he replies, a plaintive look on his narrow face, licking the blood from his lips. Do it, I say quietly. With another pleading look, Cronin lets go, and Rollis slumps out to the deck, panting and clutching his throat. I put a foot against his chest and roll him over, pinning his unresisting body to the floor. I lean forward, crossing my arms and resting them on my knee, putting more weight on his labored chest. You haven't suffered enough for your crimes, not yet. It's too soon for you to die, I hiss at him. And when you do, I'm going to be the one that does it. This is not a good idea, Wingskrieg says, before he gives a deep sigh and takes a swig from his canteen. We're taking a quick rest break from the march, sitting in the jungle mud. All around, birds are chattering, whistling, and screeching in the trees. Flies the size of your thumb buzz past, and I bat one away that settles on my arm. Who can tell what I might catch if it bit me? Other insects flit around on brightly patterned wings, and a beetle bigger than my foot scuttles in the light on the far side of the track, 3 meters away. The air is sultry, soaking us in humidity and our own sweat, which pours from every part of my body, even though I'm resting. Was not a good idea, I ask, with a sour look, marching through this green hellhole, getting slowly eaten by flies, drowning in our own sweat and choking on sulfur fumes? I can't see why that's not a good idea. No, none of that, he says, waving a dismissive hand. I'm talking about following this trail. Finding this trail is the only good thing that's happened since we made planetfall in this emperor-forsaken jungle, I tell him, bitterly, pulling my right boot off and massaging my blistered foot. It certainly beats hacking our way through the undergrowth, I mean. We've lost 8 men already in just 15 hours, drowned in swamps, fallen down hidden crevices, poisoned by spittle thorns, infected by the bleed eye and the black vomit, bitten by snakes and birds. Drokin's lost his leg to some damn swamp rat thing. And we're all going to die horribly unless we can find the outpost in the next day or two.